It's time to watercolor. Are you ready? You're going to need a few things to start today. First off, in your art supplies that I gave you, you should have 2 brushes, hopefully. One large, one small. The smaller one might be inside your watercolor case, so make sure you check that. Next, you are also going to need your set of watercolors. Middle schoolers, yours is probably smaller than this. You got stuck with the 8 set, but that's okay. And it may or may not come in a plastic case. I ran out. So some of you just got a strip of watercolor that looks like this. And to let you know, just a little bit about your materials, most of you are working with, these are what we call half pans, one set of this. This is a half pan of watercolors. And these are in a semi-moist suspension. I know I said the word moist, sorry. A few of you may have some dry powdered watercolor in a new set that I have. Most of those will be in high school. If you're using those, let me know if you like them or not. It's kind of the first time you're using it, so I don't know whether I want to order more in the future or just stick with these. My preference, I think, maybe just these. Anyway, you're going to need a few other things as well. When you are watercoloring, I always recommend that you have 2 little dishes of water. One to rinse and one to always keep clean, because I'll show you what you're going to do with that water in just a minute. Next, you are going to need either a watercolor palette, which you may or may not have gotten from me. If you didn't get a white dish like this, that means you probably have a plastic case that your watercolors come in. And the top of it, if you'll notice, has dividers in it. And that is going to serve as your palette. So just one word of warning. If you were using this as your mixing palette, make sure you dry it off really well before you shut the lid, or all the water that you have mixed up in here is going to go all over your paints and make a mess, and you'll be very unhappy. So that's my word of warning. If you use this to mix your colors, dry it off before you shut it. Otherwise, disaster. Okay. Other things that you are going to need today. If you happen to have a white crayon, you might want that. If you don't have a white crayon, no big deal. I'll talk more about what that is in a minute. And also, if you can go to your kitchen and steal some salt, salt might come in handy today, just at least for you to try. All right. Let's switch cameras and let me show you what we're doing. Let me talk you through a couple techniques, because middle school, even if you're in 8th grade, you didn't get to do watercolor with me last year at all. So you don't know any of this. All right. Here is my watercolor paper. Now I'm going to do this on a scrap sheet of paper. If I happen to have given you some scrap watercolor, you can also try this. Scrap watercolor paper. You can try this, but I don't know that I did. So if you have paper at home or in your set that you want to give some of these things a whirl on before you actually try it, that's fine. Otherwise, that's okay. So one, how can we tell this is watercolor paper? Well, if you look close, come on, Elmo, come on, Elmo. Well, if you look close at this paper, do you guys see that there's a little bit of a texture on this paper? It's more apparent in person. If you look at the paper and you can see a definite texture to it, that's the watercolor paper. Also, it should make a sound like this when you shake it. All right, and that's because it's a pretty heavy paper. All right, let me zoom out because we don't need to be that up close and personal. That should do it. All right, let me talk to you today about a couple techniques. So the first technique I want to talk to you about is how to do background. And one way to get a nice background is to do a wet on wet technique. Now, I guess I should actually backtrack a little bit and talk about how we mix up watercolor paintings. So let's say I want to do a nice blue sky. First of all, when you're in the art room with me, the black watercolor brushes never touch the watercolors themselves. And the way that I help people remember this is that, remember when we were doing the elements of art and black and white is achromatic, an achromatic scale? Well, these are black brushes which means no color. So no color, they don't ever touch the palette. Now, you guys don't have this set at home because I actually kept them for the classroom so that I would have them in future years. But it does help if you've got that larger brush in your set to make that sort of your watercolor brush. And so I'm going to put a little bit of water in my palette. Can you guys see it? And then I'm going to take my smaller brush and going to dip into the clean water. And I'm going to go after this blue. And I'm going to add it to this until I get the color I'm looking for. Now, when you are mixing watercolor, it's great if you've got a set like this where you've got lots of colors to choose from. But to get more sophisticated colors, and now that's going to be my rinse water because I've now used that for that. To get more sophisticated colors, one of the things that you want to do is to learn to blend several colors together. So let's say I want a dramatic touch of purple to the sky. So I'm going to pick it up here and I want to add it to my palette in a controlled way. I don't just want to plop it in there. So one way to do that is then to drip water down my brush till it runs in and I have the amount that I think I want. Now, I think I actually want everything that's on my brush, so I'm just going to mix it together. And ooh, I like that color a lot. It's not a realistic sky color, but I don't actually care for this particular demonstration. Okay, this is going to be the color I'm going to use for my sky. So now you know how to mix up colors. So notice this brush still hasn't touched the palette and it's not going to. Okay, so to do a wet onto wet, this is a great technique. It's got a couple applications, but one of the nicest things you can do about this is it gives you a really nice graded value down your paper. So let's say I'm going to start at the top here. Notice what I'm doing. I'm picking up, I'm picking up from the wrong one. I'm going to pick up from my clean water. This hasn't had any brushes rinsed in it yet. I'm going to try to preserve that one. Usually I make the containers 2 different colors, but we're doing paper mache right now, and all of my big containers that I usually use for watercolor have paper mache paste in them. All right, so what I have done is painted the surface that I intend to put paint on just with water. All right, and so it's pretty wet. I've made sure that I've covered all the areas and that there's a little bit of water on the surface. Now I'm going to switch brushes. Oh, I just rinsed it. This is very confusing. Okay. Now I'm going to pick up this and I'm going to apply it to the surface. Now, ideally, you would want to do this background with a large brush. So if you need to use your large brush, that's okay. I will teach you the correct habits next year when you're back in the art room. Now, notice how the color is able to blend really gently, and I can apply more at the top, for example, and kind of get like a nice sky. Now, one thing with watercolor is, even if your watercolor palette comes with white, if you want an area of white, like for clouds, you have to preserve that ahead of time, because the white actually isn't intended as a white colorant. It's intended to sort of make the colors that you have a bit milkier. All right. Now, when we work in watercolor, we work in various layers, and you have to allow layers to dry in between. These are called washes. So what I am doing is putting down a base wash. And when you work with watercolor, you want to think about working from the top down and the back to the front. Stowsy, what does that mean? I hear you saying. All right, so you have to look at your landscape and think about things that overlap. So for example, the grass overlaps the tree bark. The tree bark of a tree that's in front of you would overlap, would be in front of whatever's behind it, and the sky is probably at the back of everything. And so in order to get a good watercolor where you don't have white gaps around objects, which is what we call a halo effect, you want to make sure that you start with the things that are in the very back and work your way towards the front, and from the top down to the bottom. And this is how we do watercolor. Now, there's always little exceptions to the rules, and you might find that it's hard to figure out exactly what you need to do to begin with. But in general, that's the rule of thumb. So I'll look at more of that in a minute. All right, so that's a basic wet onto wet. Now, the nice thing about wet onto wet is that you can also do what we call drop-in colors. So let's say I wanted to add some pink onto this sky. So I'm gonna re-add some water here because it's starting to dry out a little bit, so it's nice and wet. Oh, I just did a boo-boo. Gosh, I gotta switch these. All right, I am going to pick up from my palette, I'm gonna use, in theory, clean water. I'm gonna add it to my little palette, and with my clean brush, I am gonna pick up a little bit of this orange red and sort of add it to this thing. And that's not too much. I didn't get too much. It's probably good. It's pretty watered down. Okay, so now I want to drop in this color over here for whatever reason. I'm not really painting a scene here. This is just kind of a demo piece. Actually, I think I might want a little more on that. It's not actually that concentrated. Okay. So now I've picked up the color and it's pretty wet on the brush. And on that wet surface, I can sort of drop it in and move it around. Do you see how that flows nicely? And you can sort of just move that around and use it to create a gentle bit of color. This is great for a sunrise or a sunset sky. It's got great principles for doing water, all sorts of fun things. And if you wanted a very concentrated pigment, you could take it right out of your box and drop that in too. Then just move it around. All right. Now, while we're here, let me show you another fun thing you can do. I'm going to just switch. Again, I'm not doing a scene on this particular thing. This is just a demo thing. Let me show you some fun effects you can get with watercolor. So let me create up a very dark section. Let's go for purple. Let's go this purple. Let's see what I'm doing. Here you guys go. All right, I think this is purple. It might be like a blue purple. Oh, it is purple. Okay. So I want this pretty concentrated. So I'm not going to bother tapping the water in because I know I want it heavy. Now, I don't know whether you guys have ever tried this before. This is where the salt comes into play. And sometimes you want a really fun effect. And I love using this particular effect. If you're ever doing a snow scene, it's lovely. Sometimes doing fall leaves also works really well. And sometimes you just want it for funsies. So the trick to using salt, oh, it's time to go. Goodness. All right, well, luckily I have a mask rig. The trick to using salt is that you have to have a pretty wet area down. So now I'm gonna add this purple. Whoa, okay, maybe I should have just painted this straight on. It's pretty wet. You want a nice concentrated background. And you're not going to be able to completely see what I'm doing today because it has to dry for you to see the effects. But I'll show you this, and then maybe in a future video, I'll come back and show you what this does. So if you want to use this, you can. It works better with dark colors like purples and greens and dark blues. Oh, announcement.
Casey Earl and Izzy Palmisano, please come to the office. Casey Earl and Izzy Palmisano to the office, please.
This is why I never film during school, because there's too many interruptions, but I didn't have time to do it on Friday. I had a headache Friday, so I kind of left school in a hurry. Anyway, all right, so you've got this. Now, take your salt. So I've got mine in a classic D&D cup here. And scatter the salt on that wet area. And where it's concentrated, the salt is going to dry it out and it's going to leave a speckled appearance. So again, you're not going to be able to see the complete effect of this until it dries. So next time we can come back and I'll scrape the salt off and you can see it. But if you want to try this at home, go for it. It's really fun and it's very easy. Okay, the last thing I want to talk to you about today is a technique called dry brush. So remember, we work in layers. One of the techniques, when you get to the upper layers, a technique that you can use to create more visual details like branches or grass tufts is to be able to put on very dark bits of color. Now, this is kind of what I would classify as a crappy brush. I don't know whether this is going to work or not. Let's see. Now, I'm going to have to use a little bit of water on my brush because my paint is completely dry. But I'm not going to saturate the brush. And this is where, if you have a scrap piece, you want to try it off to the side. But, oh, looks like I'm doing pretty good. I actually need just a little bit more water. Okay, now I've got too much on. So I'm going to come over here to where my scrap area is. Oh, actually, that's all right. Okay. So think about, as you get more to the finishing stages of this project, you want details to sort of pop. Let's say you're doing some grass down at the bottom and you're like, Sousy, it's now May. The grass is green. That is true. One thing about watercolor is it works really nicely if you kind of blend different colors together. So I'm going to do this brown until I run out, which is pretty much now. And then I'm going to give that dangerously a rinse. And then, by the way, you guys haven't known, when we do watercolor when we rinse watercolor brushes, I always like to use the Harry Potter method of swish and flick. And you can't see my flick, but it's a flick. And then that restores the point so you don't have to touch your bristles. Works perfectly. All right, let's go crazy and work in a spring green here. All right, so I've got just enough on my brush. I'm going to come over here to my scrap area and just see if that's what I want. Oh, actually, I could use a little more. Okay, and now I'm going to work this in. So let's say we've got the dead grass from the winter and the spring grass coming in under it. This is a great way for doing leaves on trees off in the distance. Bushes, strands of grass, all sorts of things. Let's pick up one more. Oops, too much. So dry it off. It's helpful to have a paper towel handy that you can both use to mop up, use to mop up your painting if you do something you don't want, as well as to take a little liquid off your brush bristles if you get too much on. So one other little technique, colors that are darker appear closer to you and colors fade as they get away from your eye. All right, so that's a quick example of dry brush. And given the time restraints, I think I'm going to have to leave it there. But let me just show, woo, and that is wet and running. Let me just show you one quick little technique when I was talking about back to front and front to back. So remember, as you apply your first wash, you want to work top down and then back to front. So if we go back to the example that I drew the other day, you will notice that here, and let me pencil it in a little bit. Yes, this is a brush pencil combo. It's something every art teacher should own. Okay, so I'm gonna make this darker than I would just so that you guys can see it. So here's my sky. If I were starting out, this would be the first thing that I would do. The next thing I would do would be come down here and do my hills. So these are gonna be a tree background. Then I would do this bush. Maybe actually before I do the bush, because I didn't realize the bush comes down here, I can see it all the way through the window. I would do whatever this zone is right in here. Then I would do the bush. Then I would do, I guess, this and anything else that's a view out the window. And then the next thing I would do would be the window sill on the inside and the crossbars. And then I would do my plant because it sits in front of the windowsill and inside. And then the last thing I would do would be the exterior window frame. And then the little tiny bits of wall that peeks out next to the frame. All right. Oop, that's not what I wanted to do. Guys, that's all the time we have today. Unfortunately, I hope that's enough to get started. I realized I didn't talk about wax resist with you, but that's okay. We'll figure that out in the future. So see you guys all very quickly in class today and have a good one. Bye.